Welcome to this virtual panel on Yemen. We are going to have a conversation on the Yemen war, which is the humanitarian state of art in the country and the diplomatic prospects for conflict resolution of this multi-layered conflict started in 2015. I'm Eleonora Ardemagni, Associate Research Fellow at the Italian Institute for International Political Studies, and this webinar is part of ISPI online initiatives towards Mediterranean Dialogues 2021, the annual high-level conference promoted by the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation and ISPI. I'm delighted today to introduce the panelists, three experts with deep knowledge of the field. So I'm looking forward to listen at their reflections. Welcome to Faria Al-Muslimi, Chairman and co-founder of the Sana Center for Strategic Studies and Associate Fellow at Chatham House. Welcome to Federica Ferraresi, Deputy Head of Mission in Yemen of MSF Doctors Without Borders. Welcome.
Thanks a lot.
And welcome to Rayman Al-Hamdani, Visiting Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and Research Fellow at the Yemen Policy Center.
Thank you
for those of you who are interested in publications, ISPI has just published a meta dossier on Yemen in collaboration with the Yemen Policy Center titled Yemen 10 Years On, Politics, Parties and Mobilization. Since 2021 is the 10th anniversary of the uprising. And for this reason, we choose to shed a bit of light on politics rather than on strictly military aspects as usual, analyzing how the political landscape of the country has transformed in the last decade with the crisis of the old political parties in Yemen and the emergence of new groups and movements. So have a look at ISPI website if you want. This is an interactive panel, so I invite you to submit your questions for the panelists through the QA function of the platform, and we will collect the most interesting of them for the second part of the webinar. As the war enters its seventh year, Yemen experiences a triple crisis. First of all, there's the ongoing political and military crisis. Yemen's institutions are fractured into a series of local and competing fiefdoms, which often rely on regional backers. A big economic crisis also shatters the country with the devaluation of the national currency, the Riyadh, and the internationally recognized government who delays or even fails to pay public sector salaries, adding even more shadows on post-conflict reconstruction. And we have the humanitarian crisis, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, according to the United Nations, with impressive child malnutrition rates and an entire generation of Yemenis with limited or even no access to education. For these reasons, Yemen war, which started as a domestic political conflict to become then a regionalized one, needs to be analyzed in all its intertwined phases. Federica, I would start with you. After 6 years of war, Yemen is an exhausted country with about 80% of people in need of humanitarian assistance. Which are the most pressing issues on the ground? Given your first-hand experience, can you help us to identify which areas, regions of Yemen are the most vulnerable and affected by this crisis? The floor is yours.
Thanks, Eleonora. you said well. So Yemen is one of the worst humanitarian crises. Yeah, and we as MSF we have been in Yemen since 1996 and permanently from 2007, and this is the worst crisis, humanitarian crisis that we have encountered. It's difficult to make difference in between areas or regions because we are present in 13 governorates, supporting 12 hospitals and 13 health facilities in collaboration with Ministry of Health. And what we see on the ground, because our model is that we are present in the ground, what we experience, what we see is that enormous needs are everywhere. Civilians and vulnerable population are the people who are experiencing more this crisis. You said 80% of the population is in need of a sort of humanitarian protection assistance, and this goes from the basic needs, because people, they struggle to have potable water, to have food, to have shelter, to have healthcare, basic healthcare, but also the fact that and probably my colleagues then they can contribute more. The fact that the country has been closed, this will make it even more difficult, to have food, to have water, to have medication, to have fuel. And I'm based here in Sana'a. And here in Sana'a, we experience long queues every day of vehicles waiting at the petrol station to get the daily amount of fuel that they can get. And in addition, as you said, the depreciation of the currency and the rampant inflation has made even more difficult, for people, to get what they were used to have before the war, for their life. As MSF, I would like to reinforce, and we have a better understanding and knowledge of the medical need, so the public health system has been decimated, hundreds of health facilities not anymore functioning, the staff not having salary at the end of the month. We support the facilities that we support very often with incentives. And then they rely on our incentives as the basic salary, because they get $30 per month. So this is, and it's not enough, to make the life. And enormous shortage of medications or equipment. So this is really the condition of the public health system that we experience in Yemen. And in addition, the continuous insecurity in the country makes even more difficult to reach the facilities that are still functioning, because people, they have crossed the front lines and they put in risk their lives and the lives of their children, not considering the 4 million people obliged to leave their homes for looking for a safe place. And we experienced again a couple of months ago, beginning of February, when there was this escalation in conflict in Marib, that another influx of IDPs was coming from the southwest front line, around 1,000 households, and people displacing more than once, 3, 4, 5 times. And again, a couple of weeks ago, there was, an attack in some IDP camp in the northwest front line, and 3 full camps of IDPs, they have been obliged to displace in another location and settle in other locations where, not having anything, to settle their new life. As I said, so we are working all around the country, and what we are supporting. I would say, when I was reflecting to prepare this conversation, I was reflecting where there are the main needs in terms of health. They are 360 because we support maternal and pediatric healthcare. Since 2015, we have assisted almost more than 120,000 deliveries in Yemen, normal and complicated deliveries. We see that there is a need of the basic treatment for non-communicable diseases like diabetes or hypertension, and then very often people don't find the medications in the facility, or, as I said before, they have to cover long distances, in order to get some medications. And we know that these medications are daily, so with this medication they can have a normal life, and without they cannot. We see enormous gaps in vaccination, the preventive vaccination, for measles, for diphtheria, for cholera. You remember the huge outbreak in 2017 when we have treated more than 200,000 people for cholera. And you know how cholera is basically clean water, is potable water. And this is the main source of infection for this disease. We see gaps in primary health care and in food. As you said, there is a big crisis of food famine in Yemen. And we experienced in 2020, last year, we have treated more than 7,000 children for acute malnutrition, severe malnutrition. And if we go to the most visible gap, is the gap in trauma and surgery care. In 2020, so our supported facilities, we have treated more than 15,000 war wounded or people injured by the conflict. But then what is very scary is that almost 30% of these patients were civilians, which is still a huge impact of this conflict is on civilians. And for IDPs, for the vulnerable population, IDPs mainly located in Marib governorate, living in the camps condition, you don't have the basic healthcare. And we have some mobile clinics in Marib governorate where this is our model of operation to be more close to the population. And we see that, the main diseases are diarrhea, skin diseases, or respiratory tract infection. It is really the lack of the basic needs.
Thank you, Federica, for sharing with us your first-hand working experience, but also human experience, I would say. In Yemen, surely the long time stalemate in the military conflict has further contributed to worsen the humanitarian situation. in Yemen. So I would like to return to politics. And Rayman, in 2015, Saudi Arabia began the military intervention to reinstate the internationally recognized government in Sana'a. But 6 years later, this seems unlikely to be achieved, as Yemen's pro-government forces struggle to defend the last stronghold in Marib, and the kingdom has also to cope with an increased launch of missiles and armed drones by Ansar Allah, commonly known as the Houthis, against the Saudi territory. In your view, which is currently the best scenario for Riyadh in Yemen, if any?
Thank you. Yeah, I think to answer this question, I think we sort of have to go back just briefly for a minute and look back at the beginning of the conflict, or at least the internationalization of the conflict in 2015. Indeed, the Saudi-led coalition at that time did say that they were responding or intervening in Yemen at the request of the Yemeni government, and indeed to reinstall Hadi and his government. And yes, you are right, they are very far away from that, and it does not look like that's going to happen at all. But however, we also have to look at the legalities of these sort of interventions and also consider the actors that are being involved. Saudi Arabia now wants to get out of the war. I think everybody knows this. I think they know this. I think all the political talks that are going on right now indicate that Saudi Arabia is obviously very ready to exit the war. But essentially, it's a bit, Saudi Arabia has become a little cornered. And we need to look at the relationship of the Houthis to Saudi Arabia. At the beginning of the conflict in 2014, the leader of the Houthi movement, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, had sent a letter to King Salman when he was put in the throne. At that time, we don't really know what the details of this letter, but there was clearly a will to engage with the Saudis. 6 years on, the damage that's occurred between, I would say, the Houthis and Saudi Arabia, and even for that matter, for Yemenis and Saudi Arabia, is going to be permanent, I think. But there are still chances to work around that. For Saudi Arabia right now, the best scenario for them is actually to implement the proposal of the ceasefire that actually proposed last week, or the last 2 weeks, and have been discussing it and such, because it will guarantee them some sort of security along its borders. It would stop missile attacks that are coming from either the north or east borders of Saudi Arabia or the southern border along the Yemeni territories. But obviously, there are multiple challenges. And I don't want to talk about the future of the prospect peace talks or whatever, but I'll just go in how this can be the best scenario for them. Essentially, there are three main topics that are somewhat agreeable between all the warring factions right now, or at least the Houthis and the Saudi government, which also has the same opinion of the internationally recognized government. The first point is obviously to allow the airport of Sana'a to open. The second point is to allow the port of Hodeida to operate. And the third point is a national-wide ceasefire for this. Obviously, the parties are very much closer now than ever before to reach some sort of agreement. But there are still very big differences. I mean, as somebody had spoken to me earlier today, what the word they said is that the ingredients are there, but it needs to be properly cooked. So we have some agreement, for example, on the opening of the airport, but there are limitations. The Saudis do not want the Houthis to be able to operate the airport to Tehran, for instance, or areas that could potentially make them stronger or get weapons. And the Houthis say, well, we can travel wherever we want, and who's to tell us with that? So these little differences can be sorted out, and I'll leave it to other panelists to discuss these things. But that essentially will ensure that Saudi Arabia can develop a better relationship with the Houthis. The Houthis themselves also realize that the Saudi Arabian kingdom is necessary for Yemen's development, and good relations with them, at least at the border, is required. Albeit, of course, the rhetoric on TV or the rhetoric of the leadership has definitely lessened to become more diplomatic towards Saudi Arabia. At the beginning of the conflict, the Houthis were very, I would say that the tone, the rhetoric they had towards Saudi Arabia was extremely much more hostile than now. And so there is a space actually for the Houthis and the Saudis to sort of make sure that there is a demilitarized border, or to ensure that the Saudi kingdom does not get any more drone strikes or missile attacks by the Houthis. And so if those three terms can be agreed, which obviously Saudi Arabia had put on this proposal, and it's in sync and in line with its proposals in the past since the Stockholm Agreement. So I believe that it is the best scenario for Saudi Arabia if they manage to actually exercise this. But the difficulties remain. For instance, when we're talking about the battle for Marib, the Houthis have been pushing on for Marib, I think, in my opinion, for a long time, since 2014, but there are obviously certain stages of this battle for Marib, but the most recent one, and I think the most intense one perhaps, is the one that's been going on in the past couple of months. And so essentially the Houthis are pushing towards Marib to do two things. One, to raise their negotiation power, and two, to also indicate where they really stand on the conflict. I think it's pretty clear, and I think we should all recognize that the Houthis right now are in power, and at least in the northern parts of the country, and their demand to stop attacking Marib is to stop the airstrikes in Yemen. But the airstrikes haven't been going on for some time now. So essentially, the airstrikes are to stop the Houthis from advancing to Marib, and we get basically into the puzzling nature of what is a leverage at this point. I think it's obviously very awful and it's very despicable to attack Marib at the moment, particularly that is a home for most of the IDP population in Yemen. But at the same time, the Houthis are using this because they're also used, and they also do believe that the humanitarian issue in Yemen has also been manipulated to gain leverage on the Houthis. And the Saudi Arabian regime knows that the only way they can press the Houthis is by economic manipulation, such as the blockade, such as the airport, because the Houthis have a lot less to lose than Saudi Arabia in that matter. And so Saudi Arabia will continue to fight for Marib, it will continue to protect Marib as long as it can, because it will get Saudi Arabia out of the conflict. Now, because Saudi Arabia wants to get out of the conflict does not necessarily mean that it actually wants to get out completely, but I think the military aspect as well. Saudi Arabia will need to stay in Yemen for a long time. It will need to make sure that the other factors in Yemen, in the south, that peace is advancing towards them. It's going to need to ensure that its border is going to be secured, which is going to take a long time. And so essentially the battle for Marib is in some way a political push by the Houthis. It's definitely a very reckless one, but it's definitely proved very difficult for the Houthis to enter Marib. I don't think they'll be able to take it, and it will stand as a negotiating power or negotiating stick rather until the Saudis perhaps give in to more Houthi demands.
Thank you. Thank you, Raymond. I agree with you that border attacks, the border attack issue is critical for the relationship between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia, but we have also to look at what happens inside the country. So Marib and Taiz, the other city which is usually neglected in many analyses, but Taiz is under siege since 2015. So Marib could really be a turning point for military balances in Yemen, but also maybe for political balances and conflict mediation. We hope this can be the direction. Faria, the UN Special Envoy for Yemen, Martin Griffiths, has recently announced a renewed international momentum for conflict resolution. Surely, Joe Biden's presidency is reshaping the American foreign policy in Yemen, and also the special partnership with Saudi Arabia. In these days, Riyadh has just launched a proposal, it was mentioned before, for a UN-supervised national ceasefire in the country. But at the same time, Ansar Allah has restarted on the ground the offensive on Marib. Why this time should be different from the past on conflict resolution?
I think there is, even when there is no difference in times, there is always should be a try for a conflict resolution. Even there is no bad timing for that as a matter of rule. I think the different this time, however, is two main ones. Is first, you definitely have a new American administration. For the last 8 years, whether it was Democrats or Republican in the White House, the United States investment in Yemen has been an investment in war, not in peace. It's not just being totally diplomatically silent. and active, but also by supporting the war in a way or another. So that's the main difference, is you have a war party that's not interested in the war anymore. And that party, even if it's very far, is called the United States of America. So that's quite important. Whether that will make a difference or a tremendous change, I think, and whether there is a real difference, we have to look at the UN Security Council. Should the United States and other P5 move forward to adopt a new resolution at the UN Security Council, then we will say they're very serious and something different might happen. Because the current diplomatic framework that Martin Griffiths, the UN envoy, has is a problematic and is deadlocked. It's something that you cannot really negotiate about. There is a new US envoy. That's very good news also. We definitely, whether on Yemen or in Libya or in Syria, we need to have more envoys and to fire more contractors from the security sector. That has been a tremendous problem in foreign policy in the last 5 years, or probably 10 years when it comes to the region. Now, the other main difference, I think, why this time is important, is the entire narratives in Yemen, the entire frameworks, the entire coalitions have been fragmented. Saudi Arabia is no more in good peace with UAE. The Muslim Brotherhood in Yemen have fought with STC, the Southern Transitional Council. So you have this collapse. The Houthis have killed their number one ally, that's Ali Abdullah Saleh, former dictator of Yemen. All of this fracture of narratives, of war narratives, is very good news in that sense. And I think that's, this is a war we shouldn't have started with, but it seems later on someone started to realize that this was a bad idea. And that's always a good news when you have less of an investment or less of an excitement about violence or about war, whether that's regional or that's international or local. But I think on the long term, what will really decide this, or whether this time is different or no, we have two cities we need to follow, keep our eyes on. They are Marib and Vienna. Whatever will happen in Marib will actually make a lot of difference in the ground, as Rayman was saying. It will give the Houthis either a reality check, or it actually will never stop them. And they won't stop with the rest of Yemen. They will march all the way beyond the borders if they take over Marib. It's an end. But at the same time, the negotiations happening in Austria about the nuclear deal, I think will play an important role in deciding whether we are going to totally dismantle the regional aspect of this war, or we will keep it as a fueling aspect to the larger war in Yemen. So we should keep our eyes, I think, in these two very different cities, but very critical on what will end up happening in regards to Yemen. Thank you.
Thank you, Faria. And this helps us to keep in mind how much the Yemen conflict has become also a regional battlefield. Although this war started as a political conflict for power resources, and you stressed the importance to look also at what happens in Austria. This is very crucial for us. Federica, trying to add even more info on the humanitarian issue in Yemen. Yemen has just received the first shipment of COVID-19 vaccines as part of the COVAX initiative. And in these days, the country registers a surge in confirmed coronavirus cases in the areas held by the internationally recognized government. We know that we don't have available data on what happens in the de facto authority of Ansar Allah. In which way the pandemic has impacted on humanitarian assistance in Yemen?
Yeah, you said well. So it's a month ago that Yemen has experienced a second wave of COVID epidemics, and what we see on the ground is that this second wave is, as it happened in Europe and in the Western country, is dramatically more heavy than the first one. Looking at the data, so in the past 2 weeks, in the south area, they have registered more than 1,400 cases in only 2 weeks, and with a very high mortality rate, which is alarming. But we have to put this with the fact that so far we don't have, as you said, we don't have a database response in Yemen. Why? Because we have data only from one area of the country. Yeah, so in the country we have the south where we have some data, people are tested. We saw a certain engagement from the authorities in terms of enforcement of preventive measures in the community. We have a sort of quarantine, for all the people coming from the outside in place, a good system of quarantine. So we can say that we have a sort of system in place, which is not the case for the north, where people are not tested. And COVID, there is no COVID. This is what continuously authorities are telling us. And there is a sort of stigma, so which was present also even in Europe, so stigma, against this disease, which is a little bit, it is invisible, but has a very high transmission rate. So these things, so the context where this pandemic is back with the second wave is definitely more complex, and you can imagine that without data, without accurate data, it's very difficult to have the possibility to respond, for any actor. But we can add, I can add other components and other elements, which is already the humanitarian response in Yemen is far from being adequate, During the last high-level pledging event led by OCHA, beginning of March, you know that the requested funding, was matched only for 40%. So against comparing to the 3 billion, 85 billion USD, they have the conference was able to collect only 40% of this amount. So there are less funds for humanitarian actors in the country, and this means that less actors can engage themselves into the response. Even we are supporting, we as MSF, we are responding both in the north and the south, in Sana'a, in Aden, and in other governorates. But so far, we are the only actor who is responding, promptly responding on the ground. This means that for the population, so they have, they have less support, if COVID will continue, to escalate as it is in the past weeks. And then there is another element. There is Ramadan is coming, and Ramadan is coming, on the 12th next week. And Ramadan, we know that Ramadan is an element with affect the population, affect the vulnerability of the population. The population will become more vulnerable, and this with an impact of being more, with more possibility to be infected by COVID. So the scenario is really worrying. Is really worrying, and I hope that actors, humanitarian actors, and donors, in particular, they will come back, or they will see, the need of the population, and they will intervene. Because otherwise, we're gonna this humanitarian crisis, the worst humanitarian crisis in Yemen, can become worse, with an enormous impact on lives and the population. Thanks.
Thank you, Rayman. We talk about also in this description of the humanitarian situation about the south, Yemen southern regions, where a variety of political and military actors still compete and fight for power and resources. How much is deep the political rift between Islam Party, which includes also the Muslim Brotherhood, and the pro-secessionist and pro-Emirati Southern Transitional Council? And which is the outlook, in your view, for the Aden-based unified government, which returned to Aden on December 2020?
So definitely the divide between the STC, the Southern Transitional Council, and the Islah Party is definitely just growing by the day. But the Islah Party represents a few things for the STC, and it's not just the Islah Party. It is also, in the eyes of many STC, I would say, supporters, Islah and the internationally recognized government are seen as one. And we can see this also within their rhetoric. The divisions in the South, however, and this is this is something that we really are, in terms of thinking about the security of Yemen and also ensuring the regional security of the area, the divides that are going on in the south of Yemen, and the longer that the government of Yemen and the STC do not actually implement the Riyadh agreement, the more we will see the rise of other splinter separatist groups, as we can see, for example, right now in Hadramaut and Al-Mahra. In Hadramaut, for instance, the north of the governorate, or the valley or the coast area, they're heterogeneous areas, but they're pretty much in a very general way, it's sort of divided. In the coast, you've got pro-STC forces. In the Wadi area, you've got pro-government forces, often conflated to be also Islah Party's affiliates, and also conflated to also be members of extremist groups. Essentially, this sort of division decides what's going to come over in the next few months if these things don't happen, because these groups are basically going to use the time that the government of Yemen and the STC to fight to grow themselves and push on their agenda. I think we all have to recognize that in the south of Yemen, as you said, there are tons of separatist groups. They do feel that they have been, for example, sort of put out of their ability to represent their goals and their wants because of the STC and because of how it's sort of dominated the southern issue, or wanting the need to separate. But the south of Yemen is quite fractured. The Aden-based government is no longer Aden-based, and when it had arrived, it almost got blown up immediately. And they also have gotten kicked out again from the presidential palace, and are still in Saudi Arabia trying to work a deal again with the Southern Transitional Council. The Aden security, the Aden problems, I mean, it's a city that's so small, but it has so many security challenges, and I don't think anybody's able to solve them. I think to put any concessions or any agreements between the SCC and the internationally recognized government in Aden requires a serious deal of concessions and a serious deal of UAE, Saudi backing to support these groups to agree to something. But it's going to be very difficult because the SCC is not going to drop the idea of secession, and the internationally recognized government is not going to allow that to happen. And so ultimately, we need to find a way to stop that, or to answer those two questions that will please everybody, in order to ensure that extremist groups within the southern regions do not exploit the vacuums, and also for other groups to come together as well and manage to compete politically, but with a good nature and good heart, rather. I think one last point is that basically now when we look at the south, there's been a very quiet time for the jihadist groups that have been around, and not only in the south, but also in Al-Bayda and in some areas in central Yemen. And we have to also kind of question where these forces have been going. What is happening to all these Salafist fighters that exist in Yemen now that are coming under formal or are trying to be formalized under umbrellas of army networks that are supported by the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia? We have to basically recognize that the people that fought with ISIS or Al-Qaeda, or sort of the mentality of these extremist groups, is very much present in the South. And I'm not saying this as a negative thing about that, but we really need to address this, because all these fighters that have come together to form these Salafist fighters or Salafist forces, what are we going to do with them once the war comes to an end? I don't think there are any rehabilitation programs taking place right now to make sure that these individuals, if they do leave battle, whatever, that their extremist ideas would go away. So this is going to be a persistent threat to the region and to Yemen, and particularly the Yemenis themselves first, because we do bear the most of the terrorist attacks casualties. So in short, the conflation of between Islah and Salafist parties and Al-Qaeda and the Southern Transitional Council, it's become such a big mess that almost all these two groups actually include components of jihadist groups within them to further push their agendas on the ground. And to conclude, I just think that that it is probably for the best for Islah and the Southern Transitional Council to work together in the South at the moment for mostly economic reasons, which all we have discussed, I think, in this meeting enough. But essentially, the deterioration of prices and within the North and the South. That all of the actors involved in the conflict in Yemen really need to consider the economic ramifications of this, because if it goes on any longer, there won't be much economy that will allow them to grow politically or achieve their goals.
Thank you, Rayman. You rightfully raised this point about armed Salafism, which is something new for Yemen in the contemporary. In the contemporary age, and it is some sort of product of this complex war. And moreover, we see in some areas, I think, for instance, to Thais, but also Aden, the intertwining between the Salafi belief of some fighters and local identities and local claims for autonomy. And this is another variable, I think, to continue to follow and monitor. Faria, let's talk about Iran. You mentioned before Austria and the new talks between indirect talks between the United States and Iran, trying to revive the JCPOA. The Houthis and Iran have become closer than in 2015 due to the Saudi-led military intervention in Yemen. Do you think it's still possible and also politically convenient for Ansar Allah to distance itself politically from Iran? And in this time frame, can Tehran play a constructive role in conflict resolution?
Look, I think there is two aspects of that. First, the local one, the Houthi one, which is, I have no doubt that the Houthis are willing to stop their war with Saudi Arabia tomorrow, or even last night. And they actually have constantly been engaged with Saudi Arabia. As Rayman pointed out, at the earliest, they were very positive, and they continue to actually have a backdoor channel even today. To my knowledge, communication between the Houthis and the Saudis never stopped, and I don't think it will ever stop. Now, that's not really the issue, because the Houthis are, again, willing to stop their war with Saudi. The problem is they're not willing to stop their war on Yemenis. That has been an important struggle with them. They're willing to stop the border attacks, the drones, all of this. But again, not the war on Thais, not the war on Marib. And that's quite problematic. Second aspect of your question on where Iran fits with that specifically is also, as you pointed out correctly, Iran was much less active and engaged with the Houthis in 2015 than it is today. And it actually is more powerful in Yemen today than it was by that time. And its destiny with the Houthis, or the fate, is more connected than it has ever been, even in Tehran's dreams. There are a few reasons why that happened. As you said, the war, weirdly enough, it actually strengthened the Houthi-Iran connection. But I think also there was the international withdrawal from Sana'a. when all embassies left Sana'a, the only embassy was left in Sana'a was the Iranian. And in fact, sometimes the Russian, until Saleh was killed. So that kind of essentiality between the Houthis and the Iranians only grew up, that they became the only friends who outside Yemen actively engage with them. So at the beginning, the Iranians did not invest much in Yemen. They did not actually, financially speaking, as you would imagine them. But as soon as Yemen file and war became important, it became a very, very valuable card for them in many ways. And obviously, even if the investment on the Houthis is still close to zero when you compare it to Iran's investment in Syria or in Iraq or in Lebanon, it's still a pretty liquid card, a pretty significant and pretty important for a lot of reasons, because it's close to Bab al-Mandab, but most importantly, it's close to Mecca, and it can be annoying to the Saudis in that sense. So that essentiality only increased. And if you look for the last 5 years, what happened when Yemen officially cut ties with Iran and they withdrew the Yemeni ambassador from Iran, what happened is for the first time, the Iranians actually handed the embassy to the Houthis. Before that, you always had the Iranians, when you ask them about the Houthis, there was that level of deniability. You know, the Houthis, how do you spell that? What's that? And suddenly, they handed them the embassy in Yemen. They even took care of their international, political, and diplomatic file because the Houthis became more useful to Iran with much, much less of actually even cost in that end. And what happened over the last few years is for the first time, Iran publicly violated international resolutions on Yemen, including 2216. And it became the only country in the world that officially actually recognized the Houthis. Why all of this? Why is that? I think for a lot of reasons. When the US-Iran deal happened in 2015, Yemen war was the price for that deal. You even by that time had a lot of the Democrats, you know, and Robert Mali Group and others actually looking at Yemen war as a very, very small price for the larger deal they did with Iran. And they decided to close their eyes of what's happening in Yemen just so that the Iran deal continues to happen. I think we're in a similar stage right now, where there is a need or a conversation behind doors and in front of cameras at the same time to have a new deal with Iran. Same conversation now is happening. Are we going to condition Iran to behave in the region, or we are going to normalize another fourth capital in its hands? And I think that will be decisive. Iran sometimes is, to my knowledge, when it was the Kuwait negotiations, they delivered pretty well. They actually influenced the Houthis to go to there. They played a very constructive role in that time because they had some sort of an incentive to do so, which is the constant of the Iran deal. Do they have that today? That's probably a different calculation. But my knowledge or my larger understanding of this relationship is, I believe if you ask Iran to behave in Iraq, that's not going to happen in their dead body. If you ask them to behave in Syria, they'll ask you to get out of here. Totally forget about it in Lebanon. In Yemen, maybe they will. And again, I think that's depending on whether the Houthis, the Saudis strike a deal, but most importantly, whether this war continues or stops. Because two things have constantly helped Iran and all foreign actors, whether problematic countries or even problematic NGOs, what have made these foreigner actors thrive in Yemen is two things: a war and a weak state. If we want to counter Iran in Yemen, we need to stop the war, and we basically need to empower the state rather than weakening it, or even worse, trying to replace it. Over. Thank you.
Thank you, Faria. And surely what has helped a lot Iran in Yemen so far is the great fragmentation of the anti-Houthi camp. So we can't speak about pro-government forces, since there are so many players and agendas and rivalries also within the camp which opposes to the Houthis. I would open the floor now to some questions arrive from our public, and I see special attention from our public to the role of regional actors. For instance, there's a question on Qatar and another question on Oman, and I would involve in this answers both Rayman and Faria. The first question is after the Al-Ula declaration, which formally solved the crisis within the Gulf Cooperation Council in January 2021. Is there room for a constructive role of Qatar in Yemen? This is the first question from our public. I remember that Qatar mediated in the last round of the Sada Wars in 2010, brokering a mediation between Saleh's forces and the Houthis. The second question on Oman, can Oman assume a more visible role regarding mediation on Yemen? And I feel the great added value of Oman regarding Middle East politics is its ability to play informally its role of mediator. So I would like to hear from you on these points. Please, Rayman, if you want to start.
Sure. Just very quickly, I think it's very important that you noted that the role that Qatar had played with ending or at least negotiating or mediating between the Houthis and the state of Yemen in between 2006 and 2010. I think Qatar can obviously play a constructive role. I think all the countries in the Gulf can play a constructive role, but we have to be realistic about what they actually want and what they want to achieve. Well, just because Qatar is gotten along now with Saudi Arabia and with the United Arab Emirates, it does not indicate at all that this is actually that should not be an indication that, all right, everything's fixed immediately. Qatar still has its ambitions. There's still a lot of mistrust between Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. And this also can be, this may have died down in other countries, such as in Libya, for instance, but in Yemen at the moment, Qatar's role should be in line with the coalition's role in order to achieve anything that's productive or proactive. The Qataris cannot negotiate anything now between the Yemenis because they are very much so pro-Islah, at least the regime there is, and so they do not have a neutral position like Oman does. And so Qatar's goal in Yemen is to is to support Islah, and then once the rift had occurred with Saudi Arabia, the goal was to also continue to support Islah, but to also have the Qatar arm be stronger. And so for Qatar to play a stronger role in Yemen right now, I think is just to be a better allocation of funds. And just quickly about Oman, I'm not sure really what the a more visible role or whatever that's going to do that, but I can tell you that Oman has been doing such an amazing job. Particularly, it's very, very difficult to make the Yemeni actors even sit down together on a table. I think the more visibility or the more appearance that Oman takes as a mediator will probably suck away from its neutrality image. And I don't think that would be wise for the Omanis to sort of boast around that they are mediating between the Yemeni actors. I think on the contrary, Oman needs to maintain its sort of secretive or rather quiet personality on that order, in order to remain a neutral mediator and to also continue being able to press the parties to come to some sort of agreements in its country.
Faria, if you want to add your thoughts on this, please.
To echo exactly what Rayman said, I don't know if Oman is willing to play more visible role, or even if it should in any way. In fact, in that regard specifically, I think it can play a more constructive role, and it should. But the Omanis do not like media and researchers and social media, which has been one of their significance actually in matter of regional conflict resolution. Even when we look to the Iran deal, they have always, the Omanis have nice speeches and quiet rooms with no media around. I think that's what it takes for the regional aspects to actually be looked at. However, I also don't think Oman anymore is as neutral as it used to be 5 years ago when it came to Yemen. It is in a way and another very actively engaged, and I find it in many ways more significant for the Houthis than actually Iran. And I think that role has changed for Oman from being the silent mediator in the region on Yemen since the Saudi Mahra influence in Mahra have increased, which is in the borders of Oman, which is a domestic issue for Oman. It's not even a Yemeni issue. That kind of made Oman join the countries of Me Too in many ways, and obviously to change its calculation. So it kind of play a guarantor by now, but I don't think if it's neutral anymore. Qatar is another interesting case where I think it can play a constructive role, but also, as Rayman said, it doesn't want to play a constructive role. And in fact, it's very happy to watch Saudi Arabia digging its own grave in Yemen, because that will keep it busy from Qatar and other countries. I think the Qatari policy in Yemen is to do whatever, at least so far, the Saudis didn't want. And in fact, similar their role the last 5 years. When the war started, they were very engaged, not military, but the only military brigade they sent to Yemen was Al Jazeera, which they held the Saudis with, faking the narrative locally, but also faking it internationally. It wasn't actually even in Rome. It wasn't really active or Yemen war visible until the breakthrough between Qatar and Saudi Arabia happened, in fact. Until then, you could speak to people in Europe and the media attention on Yemen was very low. So that stopped. And then obviously when Al-Ula summit happened, I don't think it's bad. I think everyone should pray and work that this work, but in a lot of ways, because these are rich and reckless countries. And when they were in problem with each other, we, weak and poor state, paid the price for that all around the region. So it's a good news. But in the larger geopolitical image, what I see it, and this is very telling about our part of the world. You woke up and you saw the news in Al-Ula. You woke up another day before that and you saw the Yemen war. Politics and international relations and wars and peace are very, very personal still. Things we're not even able to use our usual research methodological analyst tools to predict or to understand or to even calculate in many ways. It's very personal. But what happened in Al-Ula, in the larger term, I think we are slowly witnessing a new regional order and a new regional disorder. A new regional order because, again, the Gulf is, thanks to Biden, unifying again. But also at the same time, you are seeing, thanks to Biden, I mean, frightened by the new, less businessy administration in the White House. But also in the same time, you are slowly watching a new regional alliance between Qatar and Saudi Arabia on the expense of Egypt and UAE. And I think on the long term, those who are following conflicts should keep in mind what that will have, because there is many ways it can go. You have the Gulf, and the way you will steer them up actually is what will decide the results, because you can actually have these powerful, rich countries to support Yemen and other countries, but you also can risk missing an opportunity and it backfiring if the real disputes between these countries remain under the table. We are going to end up with another proxy war. This proxy war was in between Iran and Saudi in Yemen. Then it became between Qatar and Saudi, Qatar in one side and Saudi and UAE in one side. And I don't want to think we might have another proxy war soon in Yemen, where you will have Saudi, Qatar on one side and UAE on the other side. That is going to be a very bloody, keeping in mind the number of armed men and obviously the weapons flowing to the country the last 7 or 8 years. Over. Thank you.
Okay, Faria, thank you. So the rift within the GCC, I feel remains alive when we talk about what's going on in Yemen and prospects for this country. We are running out of time, and I really want to thank you, ISPI Public, for to send us so many questions. There's a really last question that I would like to share with Federica on the humanitarian action. Our public writes to us, don't you think the issue of humanitarian action is not only about availability of resources, but also other aspects are crucial, for instance, access and prioritization and capacity. What do you think about this in 2 minutes, if you manage to do this?
Thanks for this question, because will help me in complete with all the obstacles and the difficulties that humanitarian actors are encountering in working in Yemen. So one we said is the financial support, but another important is the access, which is difficult. Very often we are not allowed to work in certain areas. We are not allowed to be proximate to the population. We can, especially in the north. And we are not, we face extremely complex administrative process, like the visa, it takes 8 weeks, for us to have a visa to work in the north. Or the importation process, it takes months, to get our medications and drugs inside the country. And not talking about all the permits and the authorization that we need for our movement, movement of people and movement of drugs. All in addition to the security constraints. So there are many obstacles, and this is an additional complication for humanitarian actors in working in Yemen, and also the difficulty in using in their operational model. We as MSF, our operational model is we work in the field, but many other actors they don't. And this is not because they don't want, but it's because they are facing so many obstacles and constraints. And at the end of the day, the support is at the distance, is the remote support. And you can imagine it's not as effective as being present and close to the population. Over. Thanks.
Thank you, Federica. I know Farial want to add something on this. Okay. It was really a great conversation. Thank you very much to our guests for this insightful panel. Unfortunately, we have no more time and we must close our conversation. I apologize to the public for the questions which were not answered, but a word thank you for attending this webinar. Thank you to Rayman Al-Hamdani, to Faria Al-Muslimi and Federica Ferraresi for being with us today, for your time and effort in working on the ground in research and analysis. And this is day by day extremely useful. And ISPI events and publications continue soon, so stay with us. Goodbye.
Thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you very much.